Okay, well, welcome everybody to today's webinar. Thanks for taking time out of your busy agendas to take a look at this topic of how to create impact reports for donors. We actually have participants from over 46 different countries on today's call, which I think is actually our record. Of course, not everybody's will be listening in live. There will be a recording sent out after this webinar, but it's great to have such a diversity of people from different places on today's call. So we should also be getting lots of different perspectives on this topic. So my name is Damien Hatton, and I'll be running today's webinar with my co-presenter TJ, who's also on the call, and we'll introduce ourselves properly in a moment. I'd just like to first of all run through a few points about today's webinar. So we're using a screen sharing software called GoToWebinar. For those of you who've been on some of our presentations previously, you'll be familiar with the technology. And we're also using a tool called Prezi, which is an alternative really to PowerPoint. So we'll be taking you through using these tools, and you'll see in the top right hand corner your control panel that'll allow you to drop in any questions that you may have into the Q&A box. And it also allows you to put your hand up if you've got any questions. And we'll be using both those functionalities during an exercise during today's webinar. So you've got your control panel. You can certainly interact with us as we go. We've got a lot of people on today's call, which is fantastic. So you're all muted actually at the moment to avoid that dreaded background noise. But we will hopefully be able to bring in a few additional voices as we go, particularly during the middle section of our presentation. So yes, other housekeeping things just to put your minds at rest straight away. We've got the slides that we're presenting and the recordings will be circulated after this webinar. So they'll be going out on Monday, and we'll have one important takeaway as well that will attach to the email that we'll send through to you guys, so that you've got all the material from this webinar to look back on and reflect on, should you wish to, or indeed to circulate it to other members of your team. So today's objectives. Well, first of all, we're hoping to provide an introduction to reporting and writing impact reports with a particular focus on the audience of donors, or indeed if you are a donor listening in, on the kind of quality reports that donors hope to receive and how to check those criteria for quality of reporting from grantees. And that will be our introductory section. We'll try and give a bit of an overview as to what an impact report is, the different formats, target audiences, and some key principles associated with that. The second section, which will be the main body of this presentation, will be about how to structure a report and the key areas of content and general tips for writing a report. After that section, we're going to do a short exercise where I hope to really sort of tap into some of your own experiences and indeed challenges in terms of getting good quality reports back if you are a donor, and writing good quality reports if you're a donor recipient. We'll then move into a final section of the presentation, which will look at some criteria for how to assess the quality of your own report or report that's been submitted to you. At the end, that should take us about 90 minutes in. We've then got a 30-minute Q&A section, which we'd love you to stick around for, but we realize that some people may want to drop off at that stage, but we've got a whole bunch of questions that have been posted to us before the webinar. Some of those we'll try and handle as we actually go through the presentation, and we'll try to remember to bring those into the presentation itself. Others we'll leave, and we'll actually we'll cover as many of those questions in the Q&A section at the end. Of course, there may be questions that come up during this presentation, so do please post those, and we'll try and cover some of those during that section. Okay, so that's all the kind of framing of today's webinar, and what I'd like to do now is just introduce ourselves properly. So we've got two presenters on today's call, myself, Damien Hatton, and can I welcome TJ?
Good morning, everyone. Happy to be here.
Thanks, TJ. TJ will say a little bit about himself in a moment. For myself, I'm Damien Hatton, the MD and co-founder of InFocus, which is a social impact consultancy that works with organizations all around the world, working in international development settings to help them focus on and improve the impact of their programs through a variety of different approaches and tools that we use commonly. The mosquito there alludes to my former life as a tropical diseases doctor here in the NHS in the UK. And it was really through actually my doctoring experiences in London, in a busy London Central Hospital, that I ended up setting up a charity. It was a sports-based charity using football to engage homeless people in London, called Street League, which really brought me front and center into this world of the non-profit sector and looking specifically at social change and social outcomes. And final picture here just alludes to my pastime. I can often be found around a mountain when I've got some downtime. So this is me on top of some mountain in the I think it's in Switzerland somewhere. So that's a little bit about myself. TJ, could you say a little bit about yourself?
Sure. You know, the more I look at this picture, I think it's time for me to change it. I've got to lose the tie. So I will do that the next time. Good morning, everybody. I'm TJ McGovern. I'm a nonprofit fundraising and management consultant, coach, trainer. My background is primarily in higher education here in the United States. Very early on in my career, I was very fortunate to be mentored by college presidents. And I take that learning that I've made my own over the years and share that with clients. There is me for those that are US based, kind of little funny haha picture. For those that know the Opie Taylor, I have a large family. My cousins still call me Opie, you know, with the freckles. So that's just kind of me when I think I was 7 or 8 years old. I don't think
I still haven't checked out Opie Taylor.
Yep, still got that, still got it going on. So happy about that. The next picture, if we can pull that next picture up. There we go. These are my twins, boy, girl, and they are my sweet pains, as I like to say. They are now teenagers, so they really don't like me, and I'm okay with that. So they're a lot of fun and a challenge daily. That picture, last picture there is in my spare time when I'm not helping clients or dealing with my wonderful teenager twins. I practice the martial art of Aikido. I've been doing that about 25 years. It's really brought me a lot of joy, relationships, and a great way to manage daily stress. So excited about today, excited about the dialogue, and let's move to the next slide.
Great, thanks, TJ. And just to say that today's, presentation style will be pretty informal. So TJ is going to be jumping into the presentation at different points and adding his valuable perspective from over 20 years of experience in this fundraising space with a lot of clients. So it'd be great. Feel free, TJ, just to jump in, add your points of view on anything that we're presenting. Okay, so this webinar is actually one of a series of 3 webinars that we're intending. So it's webinar 2. The first one was a more general introduction into how to use impact data to improve fundraising. That's still available, so please do look back on it. And we'll, in the follow-up to this, you'll get a link to all 3 webinars in actual fact, ultimately. So what do we mean? Why are we framing this topic? Why do we think it's actually an important one to look at? And one way to think about this is in terms of, from a donor perspective, what's the exchange of value that's actually going on between you as perhaps a recipient of funding and from a donor perspective. So donors obviously provide funding for your services, and it's generally to address some form of social problem. And that's through running a project or a program, which hopefully generates some social change, some outcomes, some impact, some improvements to people or communities' lives that's meaningful. And it's really that exchange that we're talking about, that social change that occurs is really the exchange, the quid pro quo for receiving funding. So how a donor tangibly feels the impact, because they may never actually visit your project. A donor may not have the chance. It may be an overseas donor who's never been in situ. So submitting an impact report is really the only exchange of value sometimes that a donor will receive back for their funding. So that's really where we position the importance of having a good and effective impact report available to you. So what is an impact report? Well, it's one of the main opportunities for you to showcase that social change that you're generating. And the report can in fact take a number of different formats. So you can write your own report, and the report could be in your own particular format. And this is kind of what we're going to focus on today, is the production of your own impact report for your own organization or program or project that you're focusing on. The second is a written report as in a funders format. And of course, you may actually have multiple funders with multiple different formats. And it's a common complaint that we get from many nonprofits, is that you're getting lots of different formats and from many different donors. But we'll be focusing on your own format of report, but which you may find ultimately that this is like, you can repurpose this particular own format to actually meet your funders' format. So we're focusing on your own format of report, just simply because the idea is that you can not only repurpose that to meet the range of donors' requirements that you may have, but it also can act as a tool for you to be able to negotiate those reporting requirements. Often if an organization's already got its own approach to reporting on its impact and the change it's making, that will suffice many funders, and you avoid that imposition that may come from some donors in terms of we want new bits of data, new bits of information. So it can empower you in that, to have a more proactive conversation about the kind of reporting burden that a funder may place upon you or your organization. And in our experiences, donors are generally very receptive to a conversation about how these two things can interact, your own format versus a funder format. And if I reflect back on one of the questions that we had, this was from Morten Moller from Strategy House in Denmark, how to deal with pre-established reporting formats that do not give space to match your own ideas of storytelling. So we'll talk just in a moment about storytelling and how to sort of incorporate that into this process. But really, this is maybe one of the way of thinking about how your own format can actually interface with a funder's format. Now, of course, if you're tailoring to a particular funder, everybody has a different preference for how you might receive information. So whilst we're going to be focusing on a written report, there are other modalities in which you can then subsequently, just as you may repurpose your report into a funder's particular format, you may actually repurpose some of that information in the form of a video. Often we've got many organizations who have helped to develop website style reports that can be more click-through style reports. And on each of these, you can see a URL for a website, which is a nice example of each of these. There's online reporting formats, such as this example, which is from an Australian example, which really incorporates both written, there's video material, there's background narrative and music. So a really interactive format is this one. Prezi, which we use as a presentation style, which we're using right now for this presentation, is a great way of presenting information. And of course, infographics. You may translate your final information into a nicely summarized infographic. So there are a range of modalities that are important to consider in terms of reporting your impact.
You know, Damien, I want to jump in real quick here and
Yeah.
encapsulate the why behind impact reports. I would say globally, there's a lot of time, energy, and release of talent to secure donations. Yet, the biggest part, working with donors of all shapes and sizes, the biggest complaint they have is when I give a philanthropic contribution to a nonprofit of their choice, they don't feel like they get information back around answering a very important question: what did you do with my dollars or pounds or whatever metric we're using? So the impact report is a way to answer that question. And when you do it and you do it well, whether it's large or small, the propensity for future and repeat gifts goes up quantumly. I just want to insert that little thought there.
That's great, mate. And well, that leads us nicely into this section, which maybe you could talk us through.
Sure. So impact reports as a fundraising tool, like I just said, that the biggest complaint of donors that I had the privilege of getting to know really well is I gave money to this nonprofit that is close to my own heart, my own objectives, and how I want to change the world. They biggest complaint is I want to know what they did with my dollars. Now I'm talking a range from $100 to seven-figure gifts. That is an underlying question. So high quality impact report is a powerful tool to both demonstrate the accountability, to build that trust, that the exchange of philanthropic support, but to really understand why and how their dollars are helping you create the impact that you want in the world. So there's a great little quote here. Community impact is not just good practice, it's also an excellent opportunity to engage donors and potential donors in your work. Clear, verifiable, and effective communications around impact. And just as a little side note, I define impact as how you're saving, changing, or transforming lives. If you can't really communicate that, then it's really hard to secure current and future dollars. And it's really a great way to communicate how you are doing that. And it's in the vehicle of making it visual and showing how you're just doing that. It's just a way to build trust. One of the questions that someone sent in prior to for us to kind of simmer with was, what's the threshold on who should be getting these impact reports? My suggestion would be, obviously, when you're getting philanthropic support from a foundation, 9 times out of 10, it's usually mandatory. So that kind of answers that question. But the real question, I think, is if we get support from an individual, Should we be doing an impact report for everybody? And I would probably say no. What you'll need to do is decide what's the threshold of a gift amount that you think that would warrant your time, energy to create the report, and then go ahead and present it to the donor. My suggestion would be, if possible, I would do it one-on-one. It's a great chance to have deliberate dialogue about how they're feeling about their organization, your organization, how they're feeling about their philanthropic support. Anytime you can get and meet and understand and engage a donor, I don't think you can go wrong. So let's go to the next slide. To report, or elements of the report can also be used to support new bids and proposals. I have known US-based foundations that do look at or ask for impact reports from previous foundations so they can get a sense of how well you're reporting about what you did with their dollars. So it's just a great way to predispose or educate, communicate with potential funders. You can also share an abbreviated version of this by social media. It doesn't have to be the full blown, but really, I think, in my opinion, the entire global philanthropic sector, you're in the business of capturing people's attention. And these impact reports are a great way to do that. Make it visual, make it pleasing, make it compact, concise, and compelling. Of course, you can use this to send a report from a previous foundation or individual, of course, with permission, to a potential new funder to show them again what you're doing. And you can also put it up on your website. I think I have found from my analysis, primarily of US-based philanthropy, that donors are hopping around. There are so many choices and so many different kinds of nonprofits. So if you can show people from the beginning, particularly on your website, what you're doing with their dollars, I think you're quantumly ahead of other nonprofits across the planet.
Great. And we've just got a poll here at this point in time. We'll be running a few of these the presentation. So do you use impact reports to find and attract new donors, sources of funding? So you should have the poll is in progress. So if you can see the poll on your screen right now, just
Yep.
a quick response as to this question, just to get a sense of, to what extent people are using impact reports to find and attract new donors and sources of funding.
All right, we've got about 10 more seconds. If you have a chance, please go ahead and weigh in so we can get a chance to see where everyone and how they're deploying this great tool. About 70% have voted, and about 5 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. 5, and I'm teasing, 3, 2, 1. Okay, here we go. So what we had was 37%, Damien, said yes, they do. 31% said no, and 32% said not sure.
Okay, so an even split.
Correct.
Yeah. Great. Listen, let's this is also a topic, telling the right story in the right way. Just again, we're framing the importance of and some of the principles here around impact reporting. But I know this topic as well is very important, or close to your heart as well. TJ, as a principle that needs to not only be applied to general fundraising, but also to the impact report itself, how to tell the right story in the right way.
Correct. So one of the very important things to remember from a funder, donor, investor, I use those terms interchangeably. They don't want to know about the 100,000 kids that you're supporting, or the 250,000 acres that you're helping preserve, whatever your impact looks like. I find the biggest challenge is to get organizations to focus on one kid or 1 acre of land. That is so very important in terms of a donor trying to get their mind around the impact that you're making. So tell the story from 1 unit of impact, if I can communicate it that way. So impact reports are an opportunity for you to tell your story as a result of philanthropic change or support. This is how a life was changed, or the environment was changed, or whatever that looks like. Let me be tactical for a moment. I was working with a client here in the Midwest, and they are helping kids in a very difficult situation with the courts, and there are issues and challenges with their family of origin. They go in and out of foster care and guardianship and all that kind of thing. And they were telling the story from all different kinds of kids. So what I help them do is tell this story, a typical story of one child. Of course, the name and the details were changed, but it was an opportunity for a donor to connect with the story of one child in this case as a result of all the great support this organization did and how that individual life was changed. We tested that with a lot of their constituents, and overwhelmingly they really resounded with it versus the thousands of kids that they helped.
Mm.
So just kind of narrow that in. The real story you should be telling in fundraising is not the story about your organization, it's the story about the donor. I can't stress that enough, that make the whole impetus of the story about as a result of the help of your donor or donors. You got to be kind of careful there. Maybe one donor, highlight a donor, of course, with permission. It just gives an opportunity for a prospective donor to see where they fit in and how they can identify with someone else that is supporting your organization.
Great. Thanks, TJ.
You're welcome.
So key questions to be asked, that really need to be asked when you're thinking about producing an impact report is, how will your donor be using the report? What kind of reports are they used to receiving? We did have a question about on this that came in terms of the size and nature of the report that should be being provided. How big should an impact report be? And we always recommend asking. You can expend a lot of time and energy producing a huge, great big report, only to find that actually the donor wanted a 5-sided summary document from you. So we would always recommend asking exactly what kind of report and what kind of format they're interested in. The more you can, place this in the language that the recipient is familiar with and really wants to receive in that format, the more succinctly you're meeting their needs. So how well do they, the funder, understand your work and programs? What length of report would be appropriate? So in terms of understanding your work, to what extent does this report need to serve explaining and positioning the context in which you're working with, and how your intended program intends to bring about change? What length of report would be appropriate? And the general language. And this is a great example of a completely impenetrable sentence construct from a very academic point of view. So if for a while the ruse of desire is calculable for the uses of discipline, soon the repetition of guilt, justification, pseudo-scientific theories, superstitions, spurious authorities, etc. I won't go through the whole sentence, but this was from a professor of English at the University of Chicago. That's probably not the kind of language that you want to be using in a report. So really break down your language to think about, and the style in which you're writing into plain old English that anybody could, reading this without a doctorate in English, can actually understand it. But you need to make sure at the end of the day that you have evidence to support your story. So a great quote here from Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle's A Scandal in Bohemia. It's a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. insensibly, one begins to twist facts to suit theories instead of theories to suit the facts. So it's really important, and this is a key principle that's going to sit behind, and one of the quality criteria of a good impact is that you've got evidence backing it. So it's important to speak to the evidence that you've produced, as opposed to just, create a scenario, create a theory, if you like, about how you think your program's working, and then try and make everything fit that narrative. It really needs to be the other way around. An analysis of the facts of the matter, and then some conclusions being drawn. And that really speaks to the quality of a kind of an impact process. So that really concludes the first section of just framing why we're having this conversation and what we're talking about. This second section of the presentation is really on tips for actually writing an impact report. Here, an overview of like a template of different sections of an impact report. We actually have a template as a takeaway from this webinar, which we'll send to you afterwards, which is, it includes many of the tips that we're about to go through, and will help you structure and hopefully produce a very professional looking report as well when you're at this stage of reporting your information. So that will be, there'll be a link to that, to our tools and resources section of the website. Just download it directly from there. So, but we start an impact report with these first initial sections, which we're not going to spend too much time focusing on, but a title page and contents. Often within the contents will also suggest that you include a glossary, key terminologies, definitions, any abbreviations you're utilizing during the course of the report, useful to put in that particular section. A forward and acknowledgements, again, just to recognize anybody who's participated in the evaluation itself is an important or a useful opportunity to actually do that. And then we've got how to use this report. So if a report is long, it can be useful to include a section that explains to the reader how to actually utilize the report, i.e. allow them to navigate it and skip through to different sections that they might find more interesting. The executive summary is the first section that we're really going to focus in on, as this is an important component of your report. So what we mean by an executive summary is it's a shortened version of the full report. It should be really act as a mirror of the report and not just describe general things about the exercise you've undertaken, or anything different from what you're reporting in the other sections of the report. So you need to show the reader the most important aspects, and really it's your chance to highlight and bring to highlight those different sections. It should, however, primarily focus on findings, conclusions, recommendations. These are the most important and, or if you like, interesting elements of your report that you're going to be presenting. Less about things like the evaluation methodology. I have a section on that, but this is the section that really need to home in on the key the key results from your evaluation exercise. So at InFocus, we usually recommend an exec summary being 1 to 2 pages long. Bearing in mind, it's the only part that usually gets read. So this is the importance of the executive summary, really, is you may have done an awful lot of work here. You may pay very little attention to your executive summary, but subsequently, it's the bit that 90% read. So paying good attention to the formation of an executive summary, and it's not an easy job, as this quote really sort of purpose of the quote here is, I've made this longer than usual because I have not had time to make it shorter. It takes time to make a lengthy report snappy and to the point, and really kind of abbreviate some of those longer probably more complex conclusions that you may have made into 2 pages. So with that in mind, we've just got a couple of examples here because of the real importance of the executive summary here. On the left-hand side, we've got an example of, so these are 2 examples, more commercial type organizations. One is looking at, on the left-hand side, it's a research report for a McDonald's. On the right-hand side, we've got a retailer and looking at their profitability as a retailer. So it's different contexts than we're used to. But the example here on the left is one that hasn't quite achieved the purpose of an executive summary, and the one on the right has. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of these sections. So on the left-hand example, and the column on the right, just to the right of this example, just gives us a note as to what information is being covered in these different parts of the executive summary. So every time a business or consumer purchases products or services, they display forms of buyer behavior that are influenced by many factors. So we're giving a little bit of background to the problem. That's okay. The following report looks at the fast food industry and will analyze 4 McDonald's key products and services, giving us a bit about the report's aims. That's okay too. It highlights what type of consumer buying or business buying behaviors are displayed in the purchase of a product or service and explains why each behavior has occurred. This enables a conclusion to be drawn from applying theory to reality. Now, this section is outlining, what information the report deals with, but it's really failing to provide a summary of the results, the conclusions that have been drawn, and the recommendations that are going to be made, so which are the key functions of an executive summary. So those need to find their way into this executive summary. Here, we've started to ramble about something relevant, yes, within the context of setting the scene about the report, but it's starting to look a bit more like an introduction as opposed to an executive summary. So we need to be clear that this is going now in the wrong direction. Although a full, comprehensive and buying behavior is impossible, since everyone is an individual, it is useful to reflect on common behaviors and attempt to divide behaviors, blah, blah, blah. So this information is now, again, pretty vague. And rather than really summarizing what the report found, it's describing elements of it. So we've lost the purpose on the left-hand side of an executive summary. On the right-hand side, we've got a much more snappier, purposeful executive summary. This report provides an analysis and evaluation of the current, prospective profitability, liquidity, and financial stability of Outdoor Equipment Limited. Subject matter is clear, what we're covering. Methods of analysis include trend, etc. So we've got a section there on methods. Results of data analyzed show that all ratios are below industry average. In particular, comparative performance is poor. So we've got a section on findings. Next section is clear on conclusions. And then we've got some bulleted, and often bullet points work really well here for findings, conclusions, and recommendations in an executive summary format. So the recommendations are there, and then we've gone and given a little bit about the limitations of the report. So setting expectations about what the report is going to cover, and there's always limitations in terms of monitoring and evaluation exercises. So it's just a couple of examples which I wanted to sort of hone in on because of the importance of the executive summary. It's often the only thing that your donor or the people, other stakeholders who may be interested in this report are actually going to take any heedance of. So the next section I'm going to focus in on here, and introduction following the executive summary, we set the background scene. What's the context of producing this report, if you like. But the next section is program summary and the working context in which the program's taking place. So it's important to describe, where you're working and the problems and challenges you're addressing. Any research, internal, external, or a theory of change or logic model can be useful here. So this is where really understanding giving some understanding to people who may not be familiar with your program or where you're working is really very helpful. Some problems are easy to describe. Preventable blindness, very easy to describe, for example, and others require more explanation. It's in this section that there's a chance to tell potential donors why you do what you do and why it's important and the context in which you work. So again, another quick poll. We'll just run at this point. How many people on the call have actually constructed a theory of change or logic model for your key programs? Because this is something that we'd often suggest that you put into an annex type addition to your impact report, as well as having a narrative here in the main body. You might have a full a more fleshed out theory of change or logic model that serves its purpose as an annex to this. So I don't know whether we could launch that poll. TJ, are you able to
launch it right now? Here we go. And there we go. Everyone able to see that okay?
Yeah, we're in.
All right.
Great. So we always like to have a little bit of interaction on these calls. So yeah, they're coming in, collecting the responses. Nice.
Yep. About 64% have voted. We'll wait about another 15, 20 seconds. Well, overwhelmingly, more than half are saying yes thus far.
Great. Okay.
All right, we'll go ahead and close this poll. And here we have, so here are the results. 68% said yes, 23% no, and 9% said not sure.
Great. Well, that's really encouraging, because I mean, a theory of change, as many people will know, or a logic model is a great way of communicating how your program's going to work. So that's encouraging that those numbers are pretty high.
Yeah, surprisingly high. That is good news.
So let me carry on. Next section. So once we've set the scene as to the program and the context, we've got a section on objectives. So what are the actual objectives of the report? So that's really framing what you're trying to achieve out of this report. And obviously, depending on the focus, the scope, and the type of program, you may be looking at all your programs or just one particular aspect. Those will really be framed within the objective section. The next section I'm really going to focus in on is the evaluation methodology. So we've got this next section, which is really about describing the monitoring and evaluation that you've conducted over the course of the reporting period, and any changes you've actually made to this during that period. So this is how you're actually gone about collecting information. And you may have something, so the example here on the left we're just showing is of an M&E training manual for an organization called MISA. This is a great example of the kind of resource that really demonstrates you've got a good handle on how to collect data, what your processes are, what the data collection points are, how you're going about sampling. And this again might just be a link to this kind of a training manual, but you can actually summarize in a pretty short paragraph when all the components of your monitoring and evaluation that you've used. So it doesn't need to be a lengthy section to your impact report, but it really is a section that establishes your credibility behind the report. This is how you've gone about collecting information. And some donors will be more interested in this aspect than others, and it really depends the extent to which you go into the methodology, the extent to which you understand, their interest in this section. But we always recommend putting a piece on in this. And it could include elements like who's been involved in the monitoring and evaluation. Have you involved your beneficiaries in the process? Have you involved other stakeholders in the process? Who have you spoken to? Who have you interviewed? Who's been the subject of your surveys? And also who's actually carried out the monitoring and evaluation? What's their background and experience in doing this? How trained have they been to deploy surveys, to speak to people in the field? And the type of evaluation methods that you've employed during the process. We often use a theory of change or a theory-based evaluation, and we think it's an approach that's increasingly common now, is to have a concept in advance, a blueprint of how you see your program is going to bring about change, and then using evaluation to check in on whether that theory is correct. And the theory often presents you with some questions that need to be answered, some learning questions and evaluation questions. To what extent are the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve being brought about by the activities that you're delivering, for example? The data collection methods you might also want to just allude to in this section, in exactly what you've done. The very common ones will always be surveys, focus group discussions, one-to-one interviews, but you may use a whole array of different techniques, more participatory approaches with children and young people, video techniques, etc. Approach to sampling is important to include here, and your approach to analysis. But we do recommend keeping it, again, not on average half to a page. Would probably do for this evaluation methodology section, because not everybody's going to be interested in the technicalities here, but you've got to be aware that some people are, and this might be the most important section for them. So we always find that being open about the limitations of your monitoring and evaluation is important. And I think we had a question from Sophie Marescal at Terra about limitations in terms of the extent to which we should be transparent, and to what extent should we expose our data quality issues and methodological limitations in donor reports. I am fully pro-transparency, but sometimes wonder whether donors are really interested. What is the degree of technicity to adopt in a donor report? So hopefully I've kind of touched on some of that in this section, but our general approach is to be quite open about limitations of the monitoring and evaluation, because they always exist. And this is about credibility. And anybody who knows anything about monitoring and evaluation, who may well be reading this report, will expect to have some limitations stated. So we've got a final poll here. How many of you have documented your M&E processes and tools, for example, into a manual type setup? So how many are able to add, credibility? To what extent do you feel you're able to actually add credibility to this? So if you could run that poll, it's a final poll, just a way of sense checking how people are in terms of this particular section around methodology. Yeah, answers are coming in there. That's
about 54% have voted thus far. We'll wait about another 10-20 seconds. About 70% have voted.
Yep. Oh,
Okay.
the tension.
Wow, pretty close here. Well, not even.
Okay, how are we doing?
All right, so I'll share the results here, and here they are. 49% said yes, 31% said no, and 20% said not sure.
Okay, great. So again, majority or almost 50% have got these documented processes. And of course, this is going to be pretty key to you actually being able to produce such a report. Having your M&E processes and tools in place is going to be important to actually run an evaluation and gather the data that's going to feed into this report that you're actually producing. So it's a dual purpose. This is a kind of chicken and egg kind of question here, that you've got your M&E processes and tools in place, but when it comes to reporting, people will also want to know what those were. How credible were those methodologies that you've employed? So that's great to get that feedback. Let me just jump ahead a little. Sorry, everybody, I'm making everybody very seasick at the moment, I realize, but I just did lose my spot on the presentation. So findings. So this is the next section we're going to zoom in on. We've got 3 more sections really just to take a look at in a bit more detail. So in terms of describing your findings, the findings section is probably the main body of the report, where you're going to describe the facts of the matter. So this is exactly what happened. And a good analogy, since I am a doctor, would be a visit to a doctor, where the findings would equate to symptoms. The conclusions would equate to the diagnosis, and the recommendations that you make would equate to the treatment. So findings we're really going to talk about in this section, and they should be accurate and data-driven. And they're just describing the data that you've got in front of you. That's all you're trying to do. It's the facts of the matter. We need to make sure that they include a narrative description, because this is maybe where you've actually translated some of that data findings into charts and graphs. And again, we've got a mini guide here that you can access via the tools and resources section, but there's a range of mini guides actually, but this is one to help you question and analyze your data in a bit more detail. But also, as well as those number crunching that we can turn into charts and graphs, it's also important to include more of some of the qualitative, some of the stories that are coming from your interviews or focus groups, some of the more written narrative, and you can incorporate that into your findings. It's also useful to make notes as you go, as you're developing this findings section of your report, which you can then start to slot into the conclusions and recommendations section. So it's a neat method really of thinking and making notes as you go around the conclusions and recommendations. Using bold text can be useful to highlight some of the most important findings. Avoid meaningless precision. We see a lot of reports with, this is an example here, 12.45%, which probably 12% is going to be sufficient there. So a few tips on actually describing your findings there and ensuring that you've got a nice mix of methods, both numbers and stories and numbers. TJ emphasized earlier the importance of having the story about the individual. This is where your case studies and some of those individual stories of change can be very helpful to complement with the overall numbers, the numbers of what happened to everybody in general through your process. Conclusions. So the conclusions section is really where you're explaining the findings and what they mean and what the story, again, back to that idea of a story, the evidence is actually telling you rather than just repeating the findings. This is where you're starting to make interpretations and judgments to make sense of findings. So for example, identifying, based on the evidence, the extent to which your programs worked as intended or implications for the wider sector. So you're really drawing conclusions, you're making an interpretation and a judgment of the data at this stage. So unless you're very sure about a conclusion, we recommend using more neutral. So often we're using sampling techniques, or you will be doing to collect information. It's very hard to collect data about every beneficiary. We don't have the time and resource to do that. So you're making a best guess here from an evidence still has an error margin associated with it. So using neutral language, such as an example here from the data available to us, we conclude that. Your conclusions might also include not have sufficient data and need to make additions to your M&E going forwards. Conclusions should not repeat findings word for word, so don't just restate a finding under a conclusion, but draw an interpretation of that finding. And when reporting something that might be perceived as negative by the reader, it can be helpful to reference related recommendations and the changes you will be making to address this. So an example here on the right is if knowledge amongst participants has actually not increased from baseline to end line in all particular areas, why not emphasize and focus on the areas in which it has improved, if this is the case, if it has improved, that is. So you can, position your findings in a favorable light, whilst at the same time being very, very transparent and honest and open about those areas that may not may not have been positive results from your program. And finally, we're coming to recommendations. This is the last section that we're going to focus, zoom in on. But recommendations need to really link directly back to the conclusions and then back to findings. So your recommendations are really about what you're going to do now. What actions are you going to take? From having interpreted the data and made some conclusions about it, what it means for you, your organization, the program, how well it's been run, the sustainability of the program. What are you actually going to start to do? So recommendations need to flow from those conclusions. And obviously your conclusions are linked back to your findings. But you need to ensure that recommendations are realistic and doable. If not, you need to list a first step that you could take towards a bigger recommendation. So this is an example here. You might, at the top of the steps here, you've got completely redesign our HIV and AIDS curriculum. But an earlier step may be to just get advice on the curriculum from a best practice organization. That may be the recommendation that's worth stating in here. Because of course, people may come back to your recommendations in 6 months' time and ask you, well, did you implement all of those recommendations? And so often you find, and you'll hear it in the news as well, when a big study has been done, or a review of an incident that's of national significance, and lots of recommendations were made and they were never implemented. And so it's an important thing that you state recommendations. There's a degree of commitment amongst the management team to actually implement. So being careful here to state the ones that are doable, are achievable, are specific enough to be carried out, and consider who the recommendation is for and make sure it's tailored towards them. So again, making sure you're really clear who you're stating a recommendation, who's it directed towards? Is it internal team? Is it a stakeholder? Is it a funder? Is it a donor? Who's the stakeholder and who's the individual who's going to actually have to carry out this action? And avoid including too many recommendations, ensuring they're specific. So again, think about what people may reflect on here in 6 months' time in terms of whether these things are done. It's great to be able to say we then implemented all of the recommendations from our last impact evaluation. So there we have, we've just arrived on the hour. So what we were going to do for kind of a 10-15 minute exercise right now, we've kind of run through some tips on how to construct and how to structure an impact report. And then the earlier section, we really framed why is this important? Why have good impact reports in terms of that quid pro quo exchange of value between the funder and between the donor and the recipient. This is how to provide evidence of that value and that return on the dollars that have been donated. So what we thought we'd do just now, as again a way of getting everybody's input into this exercise, was we've got 2 questions here up on screen. So we've got the first question on the left-hand side is, what are some of the main challenges you have found with impact reports submitted by grantees? So this is a question, and we're conscious that there's quite a few people who give grants on the call today. So we've got some, so this is really aimed at the audience of funders and donors on the call. So what are some of the main challenges you've found with impact reports submitted to grantees? And what I'd love you to be able to do is just drop your answers into the Q&A box. If you have, if you'd like to give us an example of a challenge, a real life case, that would be perfect too. Just put your hand up and we'll try and get to you. And then I've got a second question here on the right hand side. What do you find most challenging about producing an impact report? So this is directed at maybe the grantees or grant recipients who may be on the call, as well as donors. Donors, of course, have to report on dollars that are given to them from different sources as well. So this applies to everybody on the call. What do you find most challenging about producing an impact report? So I'd just like to get a bit of feedback from those of you on the call. And what we'll try to do is pull out some of that information as we go. So if you could just state when you write your answer to either of these questions. I'll give you a few minutes just to think about these two questions. If you're answering question 1, just put Q1. If you're answering question 2, just put Q2 so I know which it is. And we'll just bring up some of these answers onto our corkboard here. You'll see our sticky our sticky pads here. They're quite a neat way of being able to just pull information together. So let me have a quick look at some of the, yeah, we've got some great questions, great responses coming in. Okay, just a little bit of a technology failure here, but okay. Just give me a second. Okay, well, TJ, could you take some of those answers from the Q&A that's coming in? And I'm going to come back to this Q&A in a few moments. But could you take them and just drop them into a Word document for me, these responses? And I'll just post them into directly into onto the corkboard, as my Q&A section isn't actually opening up for me.
Yeah, I'm having a little difficulty on my end as well.
Okay. Well, listen, we'll come back to this exercise. We've had some great responses to the questions posed.
The fun of technology.
Yeah. To be concise on the information I have to provide is, for example, under Q2, we've got another one, knowing which stories to choose or what information donors would be interested in most? Again, an answer, response to Q2. Not having a clear indication about what kind of data the donor requires us to report about, i.e. what kind of impact data are going to be useful to them as a donor. Let me have a little look for, we've got some more coming in. Not having a clear indication about what kind of data the donor requires for us to report about, what kind of impact data are going to be useful to them as donor. Most challenging producing reports, getting the right data for the right reporting period without lots of extra staff time. A lack of sufficient information from implementing partners to drive our reports. If we have an external examiners or consultant or hired to do M&E, how do we write it in our report? Okay, so that's a question from Mahima Barsi. So how do we include that in our report if we've got some external input into it? Well, that would be part of your methodology section, really stating who's been part of the team and who's been involved. So we've got some great responses here. We will write them all up for you. We've just had a bit of a challenge with the Q&A section here of the tool, but we'll come back to that. So what I'll do is now just carry on with our presentation. And in terms of assessing impact reports. So this was the final section of the presentation today. So in the last sort of 10-15 minutes, we just wanted to look at what are some of the kind of quality criteria that you might look at an impact report through the lens of. And this is really thinking from that point of view of if you are a donor, what you might be looking at from grantee reports that are coming in to assess the quality of those reports, but also if you're a grant recipient, thinking about what a donor might be looking for in the report that you're producing. So it's just a way of rephrasing some of the information that we've been through in this webinar up to now. So the first kind of area to kind of pay attention to is, does the report overclaim? So really thinking here about, to what extent can conclusions be actually attributable back to the organization's activities? So that's an important, this issue of attribution, and are the things that you're stating, is it at least plausible that the changes that you're documenting, or some of the outputs that are being achieved, that they actually relate clearly back to the activities of your organization? And from this point of view, attribution is very hard to establish. It always is, without more experimental and therefore very costly techniques to be brought into play within monitoring and evaluation. And for the most part, those techniques are out of reach for most nonprofits. And actually, from an academic perspective, many people question the validity of these approaches as well, because it's very difficult to isolate out contributions to change that may be coming from many different perspectives. So you may be one part player in a process, in a change process, and we often are. There's often many other things going on. So attribution is really a better word that we propose you use within this context is, and within kind of conclusions that you're drawing about your data, is the extent to which you're contributing to change, as opposed to claiming the change is exclusively down to your interventions. In some cases it may well be, and that may be a very well a very good claim for you to make, but in many instances attribution is very difficult to establish. So this is about not overclaiming. Is there sufficient evidence behind the conclusions that you're making, and is there clarity between findings, conclusions, and recommendations? you don't want to break that chain of logic between the findings, conclusions, and recommendations. Suddenly creating a conclusion that isn't linked to any of the findings that you've made is a leap of faith, and it really undermines some of the credibility of what you're reporting back. And likewise, making recommendations that really aren't linked back to any of the actual interpretations of the information and the conclusions you've drawn. So these are things not to lose sight of. Second area we'd kind of focus in on here is how robust is the monitoring evaluation behind the report. So that's it's again speaking back to the methodologies side of things, but how robust is that M&E? Has the organization actually described their processes that sit behind the report in terms of these bullet points? You know, data collection methods used, the approach taken to sampling. We can't often collect data from everybody, so we try and get a representative sample, a group that may look a bit like the whole population. Training and expertise of the M&E team. So we had a question there that just popped up about, you know, if we've used an external evaluator, where do we place that? You know, how do we position that? You'd put that in your methodologies in terms of these are the expertise that we've brought to this evaluation. But this is also one of the roles of, you know, upskilling your internal team, because oftentimes your evaluators will be may well be part of your own team who are collecting that information. So what extent have they been trained to deploy a survey, to interview your beneficiaries, to avoid bias in the questioning that they're making of whoever you're interviewing? So how was the data analyzed? The approach to data quality and security that's been taken, and the focus of the evaluation. Are the evaluation questions or indicators, if you've used those within the methodology, you know, are those stated, and are those quite clearly framing the scope of the impact that you're looking at through this report? So that's a second area of criteria, if you like, to look at a report through. You know, how credible is it? How good's the M&E? The third area we'd recommend to look at it from is how well the report actually answers the questions that are being posed within the impact report. So we often, within the objectives and the methods section, will propose that you frame, you know, what the report's going to cover through a set of evaluation questions, which are basically the questions you need to answer about your program in terms of how well it's doing, how sustainable it is, whether it's achieved its goals. And you don't want to, you know, create too many evaluation questions. But when you reflect back on the quality of the report, you certainly need to think about the questions that you have stated and the objectives you've stated within the report. How well have you actually managed to answer those questions? Because those are what you've actually set out to do. And it's pretty clear that many reports lose their focus and shift the emphasis away from the original questions and objectives of the evaluation. We've got a fourth quality area, which is how open is the reporting. So again, there was several questions that actually came in through the Q&A about transparency, reporting, openness, and this is a real buzz area that everybody, you know, is starting to shift from concern in this area to concern more so if people don't report openly, people don't report transparently, and i.e. don't talk about failure. I'm actually going to a conference tomorrow called the F Word, which is all about failure in non-profit setting, and it's about that transparency and openness. And it's great to see, you know, I was drawn to this particular conference because it's actually great to see that this is being talked about openly, and there's a forum upon which we can talk about failure, because an inherent part of kind of social experiments we're all taking part in here is there's a degree of failure happening all the time. So not everything will have gone to plan. You know, that you've planned to do in the last 12 months, and it won't work as intended. You'll have created some unintended results and outcomes. But you know, you may want to you certainly state those from a credibility point of view, but there's also a good way of stating them, you know, where you can be open but also address any concerns at the same time. But people will look for that transparency in a report. And the fifth area is, to what extent does a report include outcomes? So many impact reports, you know, may state they're an impact report, but actually they've focused largely on outputs, i.e. attendance numbers, numbers of activities that are being run, etc., rather than the changes that have occurred to actual individual beneficiaries' lives or the wider community. So thinking about how you're capturing some outcome-based information is also quite key, key lens through which to look in the process. So there's just 5 criteria that are worth looking at, and that really brings us to the end of our main presentation. So we've really covered, just to quickly recap, we've covered on the first segment of this webinar, we really looked at some of the key reasons to undertake impact reporting for donors, that exchange of value, dollars for tangible impact written down or presented in some format that can bring to life the change that's happened in exchange for that investment, and the importance of storytelling being intertwined into impact reporting. And telling the right story to the right audience. So picking the right tools and the right way in which to present this information. The second segment, we really focused in on the actual individual components of a good impact report. So again, to reflect on, and as I said, during that section, we'll have a template to pass on to you after this webinar, which hopefully will remind you of some of those key tips that we've gone through, but also act as a template for you to put together a professional looking impact report. And then here we've got this final section on some assessing, you know, the quality criteria to reflect on when you're looking through your impact report, or you're assessing somebody else's impact report as a donor who they're sending them through to you. So this is just some tips and tricks, if you like, that we think and hopefully you'll find are actually useful. We will be sticking around for another 30 minutes to go through the remaining questions, and we've got about 30 odd different questions actually that we've listed out here that have come through either during the course of this webinar or arrived before. So we'd love to try and address some of those. So if you're keen to stick around, please do. And if you're, of course, interested in strengthening your own organization's M&E capabilities, we just wanted to put this offer out there to you as well. There's a free taster course of the 7 steps to high performance. Some of you may already be on the program. Others may not, never heard of this, but it's a course and a program that helps you work through the stages of building up a strong monitoring and evaluation system. We've got a course passcode here, which is a promotional code for people attending this webinar. Essentials 247. If you're interested, you can just go to our training calendar on the website. I'll just show you here, which has a list of lots of different aspects of our training. So it's an integrated training program that covers 17 different courses over the program, how to develop a theory of change, how to develop indicators, etc. If you're interested in, you know, checking out one of these courses, may have been triggered an interest through this webinar, just click on the relevant training and you can register by using the code that I've just shown you. You just drop the code in here and press register. Same process as you did for this particular webinar. That's if you like, a free takeaway from this webinar, which we'd love you to take up on. Equally, if there's myself and TJ, we're going to stick around now for a Q&A for 30 minutes. We'd love you to join us, but equally, if you want to have a separate one-to-one follow-up and pick our brains about anything that we've been through on this, there's the option there as well to book a quick follow-up to this. When you do close out from this webinar, there'll be a quick 2-minute survey for you to fill out, which would be great just to hear a little bit of feedback about the webinar itself, and you'll be offered those 2 choices. So we can send through, if we don't want to send through things through that you don't actually want. So just tick the relevant box, and that will be that. So thank you so much for those of you who need to shoot off now. TJ, I think you're still around.
I am.
Fantastic. And I think you're poised with a number of questions that we've been charged with before or during this webinar. So thank you for those of you who've got to shoot off. But others who want to stick around, we're going to work our way through them. So do we have a first question, TJ?
Yes. First question is Q2 on the corkboard there. Measuring the impact of complex intervention is very challenging. Communicating this information to donors is not always straightforward. Any response to that?
Could you just repeat that question again for me? Sorry, TJ. I've got a list here as well, actually, and
Yep. It's from Jen, who has left, but she asked, measuring the impact of complex interventions is very challenging. Communicating this information is not always straightforward. So if I dig a little deeper, that question is about transparency and how transparent you think everyone should be around, things that didn't work or things that didn't go as planned. What's your sage advice around that question?
Yeah, well, we covered some of that in previous points, but I think handling that sensitive topics is an expectation now, and actually I see it as through the lens of credibility, because I think when people really openly and transparently talk about the things that haven't worked and the things that have failed, it's an opportunity really to show that you're not just simply taking all the positives, but you're also being realistic that this work is challenging, because invariably social change work is challenging, and you're tackling it head on, some of those questions. So I think that's I mean, the short answer here is to include the challenges and the things that haven't worked out, but there are ways of couching those things by, for example, talking about something that's not worked out, but at the same time stating what you're going to do about it, how you're going to improve that situation. So as well as really emphasizing the things that have worked out, of course, you don't want to just solely focus on the things that aren't happening. And in terms of complexity and in terms of managing complexity through through reporting, well, that's one of the skills of writing, really, is to try to boil down. And we talked about language and not using overly complex language. I think if there's a lot of detail and complexity to the methodologies, I would probably leave that out of the main body of a report and place it into an annex, and try and summarize things down as much as you can. Make things accessible. An impact report really needs to be accessible to the reader and written in plain English.
I completely agree. Next question is, how accurate should the data be for the impact reports?
So as accurate as you can make it, but this is really down to, I mean, it's almost a, yes, an insulting answer, that one, but there are limitations to what you can do, and there's an expectation generally amongst donors that certainly their demands upon a recipient of funding is proportionate to the amount of funds that have been given. So for a donor who's given you, $100 to ask for an impact report, for that $100 is completely disproportionate, right? But if somebody's maybe given you £500,000 or dollars for an intervention, it's quite reasonable to expect that there's going to be a decent effort made to really quantify what's happened as a result of that that intervention in terms of that money and that donation. So proportionality is a really important concept when you're both a donor or a recipient, and it's reasonable to question demands upon you from those different perspectives. But in terms of how much data, again, that's down to your methodology. So understanding sampling is, for whoever's posed that particular question, might be an important thing for you to get your head around. The extent to which the sample that you're collecting information from is representative, and there's enough people within your sample for it to be a credible sample from a statistical point of view. Because what you're trying to do when you collect data from a sample is make the case that the results that you've produced from that small cohort are representative of the whole population that you work with. But if you've only, for example, surveyed 5 people out of 500, you've not surveyed enough people for that to be a representative sample. So there are certain cutoffs, and at the end of the day, it's a calculation as to what that sample size should be based on your overall population size. That's something to get your head around in terms of the amount of data that's needed to be credible. Having a good sample size or an effective sample size, and most times you're going to just be sampling. So yeah, hopefully that's answered that one.
It does. A kind of a follow-up to that is, Catherine said that the biggest challenge is producing the report, getting the right data and the right reporting period without lots of extra staff time. Any words of wisdom around making that a very efficient, effective process, particularly around gathering the data?
Yeah, and the burden again placed on staff to do that. So well, part of the process of developing your M&E systems is to be really clear on the plans for data collection and being realistic about the amount of time things take. We've got again, if you go to the tools and resources section on our website, you'll see a video there about data collection and how long it takes to actually deploy one survey when you take into account the time it takes to create the survey, to pilot the survey, to actually then train somebody to deliver the survey, to then implement the survey in the field and collect information from your population, bring in the results, analyze the results, and make some interpretation of the findings. That can take 10 to 12 days of somebody's time to do that end to end. I think that's the kind of cumulative number we come up with through the video, and it's an illustrative exercise just to say basically that that people generally underestimate the amount of time it takes to collect data. So when there's a realistic understanding of how much time it takes, you can actually reduce, this. Usually what people are trying to do is collect too much information, and there needs to be a level of prioritization according to the resource that you've got available to collect information. So part of this whole process of building a good monitoring and evaluation system for your program is to go through a methodical approach to designing your process and systems, and not making it outstrip your resources. And this is often the reason why people will bring in external evaluators to support data collection, because the capacity to do it internally sometimes isn't there. But it's very useful if you can build that internal capacity, because it's then a resource you have got to deploy internally. So we
Yeah.
do oftentimes focus on trying to build that internal capacity, and your own internal monitoring and evaluation plans.
I often say, Damien, with clients that I invite them to fail fast. Don't overthink it, deploy it, take action, and then, by taking that action, you're able to see what's working, what's not. I often think also that the nonprofit sector, has the biggest challenge of all, because many of the problems that people on this call now, and the entire philanthropic um, sector, that we've inherited the messiest
Mm,
problems, that if they would have been solved, they would have been solved on the for-profit side. So, these big, hairy, audacious problems, you know,
mm,
are often messy and hard to solve, take an interdisciplinary approach that require many quote actors unquote to put it to enter or solve. So the M&E mindset allows people to feel and experience a trust in the organization and their intended impact. So I, that's
yeah, I love that. Fail
yeah.
fast.
Fail fast. Yeah, I'm full of those one-liners, as you know firsthand. Yeah, I just find a lot of organizations, and I'll be specific, leaders in the sector that are frozen. They're afraid to come across as negative, but if they or not achieving results, I invite you to be somewhat vulnerable on that and take action. Uh, and if it doesn't work, okay, we'll learn from that. But the message I want you to hear is to keep going.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So I got a few more questions here, that you may be able to answer here for us, TJ. So tips. This is from Ameha Mulugeta, who's a lecturer at Addis Ababa Institute of Technology. Tips on how to attract donors besides preparing report would be good. What attracts donors to be involved in our ideas in the first place?
I would say that a funding rationale, and so kind of let me unpackage that quickly. A funding rationale, in my mind, means when a donor gives money to your organization, you communicate what that unit of impact looks like. So to kind of break it down, and I mean, I'm seeing it more and more everywhere. For $100, this will help one child, or for $10,000, this will launch a program. So when people give to you, they know what the impact on those served is. So having a strong funding rationale is a very sound strategy to capture people's attention. And yeah, that's the simplest way I can say that.
Yeah, great. Thanks. And another similar question from John Yaboa here. We've got who's from the energy from Ghana, a program officer in bioenergy. Why are proposals rejected outrightly in the first instance?
Well, I think we both can answer that. One, I have found funders are talking to people that read proposals. You don't follow the instructions, and that
Yes.
I know, I know that sounds oversimplified, but you're not giving them the information that they're asking for.
Yeah.
And I find that to be a big barrier. Um, so follow the instructions, understand the instructions. If you don't, reach out to them and ask for clarification is always a good strategy. How about you,
Yeah.
Damien?
Yeah, I'd say that's the number one, is a basic mismatch between, what you're proposing and what's actually in the, on offer, or the terms of reference for a particular grant stream or funding stream that's available. I mean, I've worked with donors who, or many donors have the experience, should I say, of receiving applications for things that they're just not funding. And so
Right.
that's your instant dismissal, is,
Yeah.
look at what they're specifically asking for. And if you don't meet those criteria, don't apply, because it's a waste of your time, and spend your time trying to identify the better fit, the good fit. I mean, another couple of quick things that will reject people straight away is things that unproofread proposals. If you've got spelling mistakes, poor English being reflected in your application, it reflects on your professionalism. People will read into that straight away, that this is an unprofessional organization. I don't want to work with them. So those sorts of basic errors, and not ask, not necessarily responding in the format that they've asked you for.
I
People
agree.
have kind of templates that they just bang out there, and it's really not worth doing, because people are looking for you to respond in a specific way, and the more you do that, the more you cater to that audience, the better, the more successful you're going to be.
I agree, and I want to echo that. Sometimes I coach clients, particularly with foundations, that they do see alignment, so they've done that homework that you just outlined, and there is a match. And I invite them to reach out to a program officer or someone that is, community facing, and just set up a 30-minute dialogue and
Mm.
have a conversation about that, and in an effort to predispose them to really understand. So hopefully they'll see the match as well. A one-page document around, the alignment of what the foundation is willing to fund, as well as, what the nonprofit organization is doing, works really, really well.
Yeah, great, great. So I've got a question here from Karina Mararu, who's a manager of the African programs for the India International Orthodox Christian Charities. I'm interested in ways to measure the impact of your project for short-term projects, i.e. 1 year. Also, without using randomized controlled trials, so that's the experimental kind of approach we were talking about before, how you make sure that the data you collect reflects the impact of your organization. So the question there is really about attribution. So randomized controlled trials, for those of you who are unfamiliar with that, they're a kind of an experimental approach that's very well suited, for example, in the medical profession, where you can easily control variables. So you can give this group a pill, and you can not give this group a pill, and that's you controlling the variables. They're the same group, same factors affecting them, same disease. One gets it, one doesn't. Very easy to do in the kind of medical setting. Well, not very easy to do, but much easier to do than in the social setting, where controlling the dose of what you give to somebody in terms of an intervention that's about their behavior or about how they do certain things is much harder to control, and many other people may be intervening, whether that's family, whether it's friends, whether it's other programs, whether it's schools, in that change process. So the simple answer to that is that attribution is something that is very difficult to establish, and probably your most tangible or realistic way of making the case for your program intervening is by having a very strong theory of change about how your activities bring about particular changes, and then trying to support, some of those linkages between your activity with data. Now, but so I think it's this issue of attribution is something that's hotly debated, but it is something that most people accept. It's unrealistic to expect a social sector organization who really needs to limit what they spend often on monitoring and evaluation, or have limited resources in this space, to do anything other than show their contribution. So start using the word contribution as opposed to attribution, would be my headline tip, unless you're prepared to invest significant amounts of funds in things like more quasi-experimental and experimental techniques, which are dubious at best in terms of their results. So you could spend hundreds of thousands of pounds in this space and really have results that are probably not much better than the ones that you'd get from more modest approaches. So in terms of the short-term projects, and looking at impact from short interventions, again, you need to be realistic here about what is achievable and what can change during a period of time. And so something that's an important thing to establish around the indicators that you're using for evaluation purposes. So indicators being the measures of success as to whether you're bringing about a particular change. How are you indicating that that change has happened? Within an indicator, it's important to understand the threshold of change. How much change needs to happen in order for you to say that outcome, that change has occurred? Because ostensibly any intervention brings about some degree of change, but whether it's enough change for it to be meaningful is an important question to be asking. And often that threshold of change has a time frame. The amount of change required, the degree to which confidence needs to go up, or the extent to which somebody needs to increase their understanding of a particular topic, or takes time. So there can be some estimates, but there is no point in looking for changes that ostensibly would never have occurred, or be very difficult to occur during the short time frame of your intervention. So it's much more realistic to then look for the much shorter term outcomes, which should be more transparent to you, more easily gathered. So you're looking for probably more output data and maybe some early stage or intermediate stage outcomes to focus on in your data collection for short-term projects. But you can, of course, still evidence those things. Yeah, so I've asked and answered. Any other questions from you? I've got a whole list of questions here. But any grabbing your interest, TJ?
Some of them I've answered in the questions box. So I just can't stress the importance of the story, and I didn't really go into this on our on the actual meat of the webinar, but the story spine, I know I've talked about that in previous webinars, but that's just really important to really tell a good story. And the story spine, in essence, is created by a playwright named by the name of Ken Adams, and it's just really a tool for creating well-structured stories. And I'll just kind of hit the high points of that. Is the platform, once upon a time or every day, then the catalyst, then one day your nonprofit came along and changed this individual's life, or whatever that looks like, the consequences because of that, the climax, and then the subtitle is finally, and then the resolution and the moral of the story are ever since then. So that's a really good way to kind of think about how to tell stories. And I found that organizations that are able to capture attention stories, nonprofit organizations, the correlation between telling good stories and their fundraising objectives and goals and reaching those goals I have found there's a high correlation between telling good stories and raising amount of money to make the impact that you want in the world.
Great. Yeah, really, really great. I've got another one here from, or a request here from Olga Shetnina, who's an independent consultant at the Ukrainian Evaluation Association, who I know well. Hi, Olga. People are less and less inclined to read even a 20-page evaluation report. Evaluators need to use infographics. Please recommend free infographic resources that can be used to present evaluation findings. So we've got a list of those, actually. We'll send those through to you, Olga, and anybody else who's interested. But I agree entirely that summarizing down information into another graphic, it's just another medium through which to communicate. And many people, a picture tells 1,000 words, as they say, and so a good infographic that captures a lot of data, place on part of um, so,
Damien, you're breaking up. I can't really hear you. Okay, you back?
okay, yeah, I'm
Oh, you're breaking up again. Technology.
I'll let you take over.
Damien, we can't hear you. Damien, are you there?
Hello, sorry about that. I don't know what's
Okay.
happened.
Yep,
I
you're
am
back.
back.
Yep.
A slight interlude there.
I blame Tom, but we'll talk about that later.
Yes, that Tom is our gremlin in the system. So I just had another question here. I think we've got a few more. Well, we've got 10 more minutes to work through these if you're okay.
Of course. Yep.
So we've got one from Pamela Sadlow from the Americors Vista. At Sikoa Aging and In-Home Solutions. Our elderly customer base is often pulled into self-assessments for various nutrition programs. Do you know any creative ways to communicate impact without participants' self-assessments? Is there a way to address lack of assessments if many decline? So I'm just trying to, yeah, I mean, there's a whole range of different approaches, Pamela, to collecting information from different audiences and audiences that have particular needs or barriers maybe that exist. I don't know what setting you're in there working with the elderly customer base here, but if they've got particular impairments that may struggle to communicate or write their responses, there are a range of different mediums such as video and observation can also be useful in that setting, and also you know, rather than self-assessment, which can be quite tricky to do and is reliant quite heavily on the individual's understanding of what the process needs to look like and what you're trying to achieve. It may be that you're better doing, administering interviews yourself. I don't know whether I'm getting at the answer that you're looking for here or at the question, but it seems to be around self-assessment. If that's the main modality of your data collection, there may be some more appropriate ways depends upon the kind of barriers that the group that you're working with. are experiencing. And you know, this speaks as well to sometimes it's, you know, we talk now about participatory M&E a lot, which is really this idea of involving your beneficiaries in both the design as well as the collection of information. So really engaging, you know, your beneficiaries in, you know, whether a self-assessment process is actually useful, whether they think it's a good approach. How else could they, you know, could you be collecting information? Might be a question that you actually openly ask with your beneficiaries. So there are a range of creative approaches that you can take, but also you can also ask your beneficiaries about those approaches and how to handle that. So, TJ, you've got any others there that?
I do not. I answered some of the questions in the question box, and I think we have about 29 people that have left. You want to open it up for one or two questions and then close her out?
Yeah, absolutely. So if anybody has any questions, please, we've because we had quite a volume of people on the call earlier, which sometimes makes it tricky to bring in people. But if you've got questions, feel free to put your hand up, and we'd love to bring you into the call and see if we can answer that. Or of course you can just stick your questions in the question box, which I hope we've hopefully managed to answer. Let me have a look at some of the questions here.
There's more of a statement, but from Sharon McKenzie. She wanted us to do a course on how to write unsolicited proposals that will excite donors. Would be a good course. Interesting. Um, I
Yeah.
you know, on a personal level, I'm not a fan of spray and pray. I think there needs to be some work on some identification around, you know, alignment of interests, that kind of thing. So that'd be more of a discerning kind of approach and mindset to see who matches uh, and who has interest in the impact that the organization's making.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a couple of observations here. Avoid jargon and varying language. Can we get the material for the first webinar, as I've missed the first one? You can indeed. The link to the first webinar will come with the recording page for the second. So you'll get that Monday along with the resources we've talked about in this webinar. Let me see if we've got any others. How to evaluate complex subnational governance program, which is aimed to support governments. So that's a pretty big question, and I don't think I've got a pithy answer to that one. But
Notice I avoided that one. So.
yeah, yeah, he's swerved that one. Well, it's really, I mean, how to see monitoring and evaluation overall is as a process. And, you know, you can answer questions to anything, provided you work through a process methodically of thinking about, you know, what those, you know, and really the process of aligning what's realistic to do, i.e. the resource that you've got available to you, to some questions that you want to get answered. And the approach that you can take to answering those is, you know, there's multiple approaches basically. But let's not overcomplicate it either. There is, you know, all monitoring and evaluation is about is asking questions and finding answers to them. And some are more complicated questions, and you've got some approaches that you can use to answer those questions, and matching the right approach to answering a question, the right
Steve,
methods to that is kind of what the trick is here.
would it be safe to say that the whole purpose of M&E is to reduce uncertainty from an investment point of view, from donors, whatever
Mm.
that looks like, and then organizationally from an internal lens to make sure that the organization is in alignment and staying true to its purpose? Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah, de-risking investment is I mean, that's why from a donor point of view, there's such an emphasis on, there needs to be that accountability. From donors need to be accountable as well. So, they putting money in one program is always at the cost of putting it somewhere else. So de-risking it is, there's very few ways, if you think about it, that you can. I mean, it's, some funders will just, some funders don't go down the evaluation route. Actually, they think about other ways of de-risking their investments, and because there are other attributes, if you like, of non-profits that we know mean they're more likely to be achieving change. Great leadership, strong senior management team. They'll look for that in a project, in a program, above data, for example. Some people don't have much sway by data. Other people look at the actual organization itself. But people need ways of reducing the risk of that investment, and certainly for the mainstay impact reporting and expecting a report about the impact is a good way of doing that.
Got it.
Yeah. So I think if we've missed any of your questions off here, I've got one last one here from Gladys Mungai of UN Habitat. How long should an average report be, and should one make reference to the budget and financial requirements? So yeah, this is the last question from Kenya. So how long should the average report be? Well, I think I think this came up during the presentation as well. There is no set answer to that, and the best way to get the answer to it is to ask the donor. Don't feel worried about, if you've got a particular donor that you're aiming at reporting back to, ask them, how long would you expect this report to be? They may say, 10 pages, they may say 50 pages, or no more than 30, etc. If I was to give an average, most of our evaluation reports that we'll do as an external evaluator will range around 20 to 30. It's kind of a manageable number that people can get through. More detail-oriented organizations will, maybe go up to 50 pages. But also we'll get some people who just say, look, I just want a 10-page report in which all the detail will be annexed, and you're just getting to the sort of like almost like an extended executive summary. So the exact answer to that depends on the audience, as all of this communication does. Who's the funder, who's the audience, and hopefully that. And in terms of reference to the budget and financial requirements, so if you're thinking there from the perspective of putting out a terms of reference for an evaluation and stating what budget is available for that evaluation, I would always recommend you do state a budget that you've got available to do the evaluation. The reason being is people like myself who will pick up a terms of reference as an evaluator and look at it and go, well, should I, put a proposal in for this piece of work? I'll often reject ones that don't have a budget in it, because often you can end up presenting a solution that completely outstrips the actual budget that they've got in mind, because everybody's always got a budget in mind, they just don't state it. And there's that, it often comes from the perspective of, you know, it'll come
Agree.
from this perspective of, we don't want to put this out there because everybody's going to pitch to that level. If we say this is worth 5k as a terms of reference, everybody puts in proposals for 5k. If they put in 50k, it gets to 50k. But the value of doing that is that you'll get comparable proposals. You'll get, if you've set 10k available to do this evaluation, you'll get 10 proposals all around the 10k mark, which are comparable. And you'll be able to see like against like what's useful. Who we could go with. The flip side of not putting it in is that you'll get 10 proposals, but one coming in at 40k, one coming at 30, 120, 110, 1.5, 1.2, and nothing's comparable. And actually, you'll just go at the end of the day with the one that came in round about your budget that you already had in mind. So you don't end up getting the evaluator you wanted, or necessarily the best evaluator.
I agree. I completely agree. I think I encourage organizations to put out what their budget is and then go from there. Because yeah, you're right. I often say we could do a 50k proposal or a 5k proposal. It's based on time, input, and delivering a value.
Yeah, you end up wasting a lot of people's time if you don't state budgets.
Well,
I've wasted a lot of time pitching for things and then finding out actually, there was never this budget available. So that can be quite frustrating. So, and you waste your time because you don't get comparability in the proposals you've got to, if you are the one looking for proposals to come in, you don't get, things that you can compare like for like and see what the value proposition in there is. Okay, well, listen, TJ, any final points of thoughts or nuggets from your side?
You're adopting the language. Nuggets, yes. Don't be afraid to always adopt the attitude of just ask. Um, Ask people what, like as Damien said, how many pages. Ask for their input. Ask for their advice. Ask for their interest. So adopt that attitude of always asking. And I see this a lot in the nonprofit sector. There's a lot of mind reading. I wonder if this would be too much or too little. Ask them, and they'll give you that direction that you need, so you can manage your energy and not waste time trying to guess. That's my final little nugget there.
Well, that's fantastic, TJ, and thank you for all your input. Thank you, everybody, for attending
Yes,
today's
thank you.
webinar. And as I said, the recording will be coming with the tools. Thanks for all your time, and we hope to see you again, speak to you again at the next one. Thanks, everybody.
Bye bye.
Bye.